Scott, and hello, everybody. It's a pleasure to be here. I look forward to this Wednesday night group. I start with a few minutes of just talking about a topic, and then we can have discussion about that topic or about anything you really want to do. But one thing that seems to come up, and these themes seem to run through my day and my friends' days and my clients' days. And so there's been a lot of talk lately in my world about grieving the addiction and what a necessary step that is for us to do for recovery. So it's grieving the loss of the addiction and the consequences of it, but it's almost counterintuitive. Addiction causes a lot of problems, but in recovery, in early recovery, we often find ourselves really struggling to let go of it and grieving all that it was to us. And it's important. I also want to point out here that sometimes what we're really grieving is not just the addictive process, and which really is our primary relationship in our lives, that addiction, but we're grieving often the fantasy of the addiction. And we see that particularly with the intensity addictions like sex addiction or porn or chemsex, where there's this really bright burning fantasy based on a lot of dopamine that has flooded through based on those addictions that really sort of, it's almost like euphoric recall, where we remember the good parts and kind of skip over the messes that it caused and the pain and the feeling horribly depressed and the remorse and the sadness and the complications in our lives and all of that. We tend to skip over that. And in the same way in early recovery, I think we can think about the fantasy of the addiction. And for many of us, at least in the beginning, there was some exciting times. It was intense, it was distracting, and sometimes it was good. But almost inevitably, these addictions particularly go south. They get complicated. And yet despite that, we tend to hang on to some sadness about losing the possibility of all that intensity, even though it wasn't really sustainable and was causing us a lot of harm and actually interfering with our ability to develop more healthy, intimate relationships. So I wanted to just talk about that a little bit tonight. I said that addiction is a relationship. And I believe, at least in my life, my addiction was my primary relationship. It took priority over every other person or thing. The addiction came first in terms of protecting it, making sure I could fund it, making sure I had the time for it, or making time for it at the expense of people, places, and jobs and everything else. So it's a relationship, and it's a relationship that develops over a period of years. We don't just instantly become addicts. It often, in fact, oftentimes, at least in my case, and in the case of a lot of clients I know, addiction gets superimposed over kind of dysfunction that is rooted in trauma and in childhood. And addiction becomes a coping mechanism for that. And so it serves a purpose for us. It's a functional kind of dysfunction. And I think it's a real change after often lifelong patterns of using these addictive behaviors to kind of help us maneuver through life by avoiding or dissociating or not feeling. To give that up is really scary. And I think there's some resistance to that, of course. And it takes time as well. Dismantling that, it's a whole lifestyle, it's a process, it takes time. I wanted to use probably the overused Kubler-Ross's stages of grief. And they're very helpful. They're not universal, and there's certainly other ways to kind of cut the pie on grief. And the other thing I always want to mention, because people just assume it's kind of a linear thing where I start out in denial and go through anger, and suddenly I wake up and I'm in acceptance. And it's true that we usually start out with denial. We usually end up with acceptance, but it's not all clean cut and linear. We go back and forth, and on any given day, you can be bouncing around between all of those stages. One in acceptance, one in next, and back in denial, then in anger, and so on. So just remember, it's a kind of one step forward, two steps back, two steps forward, one step back. It's kind of a weird process, but it's a useful model to describe just a little bit about this idea of grieving the addiction. One, so denial is the first that she talks about. And really, of course, we know that denial is the hallmark of active addiction. It's a way that we preserve the addiction. It's a way that we kind of distance ourselves from the harm it's doing us, the harm it's doing to people that we love. And it requires us to almost deny the relationship, the nature of this relationship and all the damage it's doing in order to keep entertaining it. And so there's a good bit of denial where we're not willing to acknowledge the harm that's done. And that takes many forms. It's familiar with everybody on the program here tonight. The next stage she talks about is anger. And I think this is where we finally realize that we are in a kind of a damaging relationship with this addictive behavior. And the denial is starting to crack a little bit, and we have a reaction to that. We get angry. And I always remind my clients that anger is a secondary reaction. If we can drop down into the anger, it's usually something more primal, if you will, fear, sadness, hurt. And I think for me, it was a lot of fear about really getting rid of the addiction. I got angry at people that were telling me I had to change, and I was angry at the addiction itself, and I was angry at myself, and just a lot of anger going around in terms of understanding that I wasn't in control. And I think that was a very frightening realization for me. And this anger can go, as I said, at the drug itself, or at the behavior, the sex addiction. It can go at the consequences, the people that are nagging us to do something different and not be in our addiction. So there's a lot of anger at feeling betrayed. I certainly felt like at the end, my addiction wasn't working like I hoped it would, which was to help me kind of dissociate from feelings and numb and drop into this alternate kind of fantasy universe. And I wasn't doing it anymore. And I had escalated, as we all do. We kind of try more and different things, and our patterns change and morph and kind of get darker, and that even wasn't doing it anymore. Now, so I was angry at that too. So this thing had cost me all kinds of relationships and jobs and friendships and everything, but even that wasn't working anymore. So it was just really, I felt, and this is where I think a lot of addicts drop into that other familiar state, which is being a victim. I felt very much victimized. And that's not a healthy place for anybody trying to stay in recovery. So I felt abandoned, basically. And abandoned by my addiction. And abandonment is something that was familiar to me anyway. So it hurt kind of doubly. And so the thing though, and we start to see some of these aspects of denial can really start to become an impetus to recovery. And I think I got kind of angry enough at it and came to my senses enough, just enough to be willing to try a 12-step program and try, as it became clear to me that I really was powerless over my addiction, and to try experimenting with surrendering to it as best I could. So anger actually kind of served a purpose for motivating me in my early recovery. The next step that Kubler-Ross talks about is bargaining. And bargaining is something that we see this, how we have this problem, but let's see, if I'm an alcoholic, maybe I go from hard liquor to beer. Or if I'm a meth user, maybe I just do every other weekend instead of every weekend. Or maybe I cut out the strip malls, but I'll hang on to my porn. Strip malls, the strip clubs. Maybe I'll cut out strip malls for that too. I'm sure there's an addiction for that. Where we kind of bargain with ourselves and try to hang on to whatever vestiges of the behavior that we think will work. And many of us spend a lot of time, years, in that bargaining phase, trying to get it to work. I couldn't believe that I was more of an alcoholic and that the alcohol was the problem. So I went through a whole series of steps to try to get my life back on track, with giving up cigarettes, thinking that was the problem, getting a little cat, thinking I needed somebody to love and love me. And that poor cat was messy, poor thing, because I was in my full disease and she was crazier than I was. I thought I had too much time on my hands in the evening, so I got a master's degree. None of it worked. I became a vegan. So eventually I had to face the reality that it was anger. All that bargaining didn't do anything to get me out of the hole that I was continually digging myself in. So then once that all crashed in, then there's depression, right? And the depression where we understand the depth of the damage that our addiction has done to us. And this is where deep despair can really come in too. It's like where there's no answer, we feel hopeless. A lot of this, by the way, is our brains, the effect of, especially these intensity addictions, sex, porn, and chemsex, does a number on our dopamine circuitry. And there's a period of adjustment in early recovery where people do get depressed and they do have a state we call anhedonia, this inability to experience pleasure. So that can be a problem with this deep mourning, that relationship, and fear of living without my substance, not knowing kind of what my life was going to be like. And then finally, the acceptance. And for me, acceptance was just when the pain just got so bad, I surrendered. And I do want to do something. So we've talked about before, the paradoxes of the program is wonderful, but surrender is one of those. I really got my life back by surrendering to the addiction, and I was freed, and with a lot of hard work and a lot of recovery efforts. But if we can find then our way to this path of recovery and process this, really let go of our addiction. You know, I think a lot of us maybe are pushed into treatment or a program or somehow find our way in, and we struggle with it and take some back. You know, I think that's where we have to really go through this grieving process and really truly let it go. Because if there's still that little sneaky thought in my mind that a little bit of my addiction would be okay somehow in my world, that's a problem. And so that's why the constant vigilance, constant approach, and really developing new ways of coping, the work starts then. But it's really important to, I think, understand what pieces of our addiction, or what are we, first of all, glamorizing, you know, fantasizing about, thinking, gee, I'd like to be able to replicate that, but without the addictive behaviors. How can I do that? That kind of stuff that's a bargaining thing too, by the way. A lot of meth clients I work with want to have meth sex without the meth. And they want to hang on to that intensity that's really unsustainable and not very realistic. So anyway, the bottom line, really face any kind of vestiges of that you're holding on to of your addiction, and magical thinking about it, and really try to face it and let it go. Thanks.
Thank you, David. Type your questions into the Q&A feature. We've got one there already, but I've got a couple things I wanted to ask David. And then one that I wanted to say, you mentioned surrendering to the addiction is one of the paradoxes of recovery. And I always phrase it as, we don't surrender to the addiction, we surrender to the reality of having an addiction that we need to do something about. And yeah, just in case anybody, I knew what you meant, but yeah, because we don't really surrender to the addiction. We battle the addiction, but we surrender to the reality that we have to do something about it. And that's very important. And you finished up, and but I wanted to maybe get you to talk a little bit more about the intensity. We have to grieve the intensity, whether you're a sex addict or a porn addict or a chemsex addict. These are all intensity addictions, and that intensity is not coming back in sobriety. So I wanted to ask you to elaborate on that a little bit, and maybe talk a little bit about how betrayed partners sometimes can get used to the intensity of the dramatic relationship and may have to grieve that. I mean, it's not just addicts who have to grieve. Sometimes it's people around the addicts who have to grieve. And there's another question that I want to ask that's a follow-up to that. So can you talk a little bit about the intensity and the grieving of? You
bet. Yeah, so the intensity is a huge thing, because intensity itself is serving a function for a lot of us. The intensity really, there's a lot of research now happening that really correlates the need for intensity, this chasing intensity, with certain ways of coping with trauma and patterns where we distract ourselves and we seek intensity that mimics one of our body's core responses, which is fight or flight. And it's this fight or flight mechanism that we seek to kind of create as a way of escaping uncomfortable feelings. And we see it with sex and porn quite dramatically, and amphetamines more dramatically. And it's really something where that intensity is so appealing because it's such a strong reward of dopamine. And it's this walking this line kind of between excitement and terror on these addictions, with these intensity addictions, because it can easily we can get overloaded with it. But I think chasing that intensity is something that in itself serves a purpose. Like all addiction, if we don't manage if we don't replace how it's functioning for us as a kind of a coping mechanism with other healthier ways to do that, and to manage those feelings, it's going to get us in trouble. So, but what we do, we get the read bar thing gets set so high where the super stimulants of sex, porn, amphetamines drives it so high so that there's a baseline level of stimulation that we require to even get excited about anything, not just sex, but food, our hobbies, things we love, all that. So that in itself becomes addictive. And so when we face the prospect of losing that intensity, it's a little bit parallel to somebody who's bipolar and loves that kind of manic phase because they don't need to sleep very much, and then they feel very creative and they're very expressive and they have energy to do all this stuff. And so they're reluctant to take their medication because they don't want to give that up. And I think there's a little bit of that. That's kind of a parallel with that need to kind of rework that need for intensity, because it leads to no good things and it escalates, and we constantly are seeking it out in other ways. So to really grieve that need for the intensity, and what does that mean practically? I think people need to have certain skills to manage or to develop a tolerance for uncomfortable feelings, for empty space, for boredom, for unplanned time, for low intensity, for a sex life full of intimacy, but that's just slower paced with one person over time. And something like porn addiction, where you're looking at multiple images over and over again, trains our brain to need new novelty and stimulation every few seconds, and that just doesn't translate to having sex with a real person. It's just a whole different experience. And so learning how to help our brain readjust that. So the intensity is one thing. From a partner point of view, I think it's an interesting approach, because life with any addiction like this carries, by definition, a lot of drama, a lot of chaos, a lot of stimulation, sometimes a lot of excitement. I've talked to partners who sometimes like the intensity, but then it kind of turns on them and it doesn't feel so good in the long run. But I think it's a definite change in the relationship pattern. And so I think the partners have also adapted to this high level of kind of chaotic intensity and change, and this exhausting pattern of endless kind of crises that become a way of life. And I think also the partners have to kind of switch gears a little bit. Some relationships have morphed into the bond between with the couple being one of kind of drama and chaos and anger. Sometimes that's kind of what's left of the relationship after the addiction has kind of eaten away everything else. And so they have to kind of rework their own relationship to how they relate to their partner, the addict, and how they relate to their own feelings with being able to sit with calm times and no problems. And because when you're a partner of an active addict, all the focus is on the addict. They're the ones acting out. It's their behaviors that are always kind of causing a lot of drama. And if the partner themselves has feelings that are perhaps uncomfortable and that they want to avoid, living with an addict is a good way to keep the focus on someone else. And so I think it's important to be ready to kind of have a lot of support for partners so they can deal with those feelings that come up once that drama pump gets turned off.
Yeah, thank you. For those of you who joined us late, our topic today is grieving the addiction, but you can ask us questions about anything to do with addiction and recovery. Type them into the Q&A feature, and we'll get to them. I promise we'll get to them in a minute. But it seems to me like all 5 stages of the Kubler-Ross grieving cycle could be looked at from not only the addict's perspective, but the partner's perspective. Anger and bargaining, and I mean, we've seen partners bargain, almost as much as the addicts will bargain, but in different ways and for different purposes. The betrayed partner really wants to feel safe and secure in the relationship, whereas the addict still wants to be an addict, on some level.
Right.
One of the things I wanted to ask you about, and this is one that I think really applies to both the addict and the betrayed partner, is grieving the life not lived. And this is one that a lot of addicts don't really put down as a consequence. Like when they're working step 1, they don't think about all the stuff they've missed. They just think about the really obvious consequences, like my wife found out and she's threatening to divorce me, and now I got arrested or I lost my job. They don't think about all of the missed opportunities. And that affects not just them, but their whole family. I mean, everybody around them is impacted by that. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, that's a huge factor, actually, because the consequences of addiction on not only the addict, but the partner and the entire family involve, they have financial consequences and job loss and opportunity loss. And there's costs that are I guess what we could call ambiguous losses, where there's definitely a feeling of loss, something, but there's like, you can't really point to it. There's nothing there physically that was removed, but it's a something that is kind of just gone with no trace, because it never existed, that the opportunity never was taken. I think that begins to weigh down on people very heavily. And you're right, it's a great point, because every addict has, and every partner has experienced through the addiction, lots of things that just never happened. And I think with age, especially, that starts to take a toll, because you start to realize, we at some point, we're too old to do X, Y, Z, and yeah, it just happens like that. I think, in my own case, I've done all right, but my goal was to go to medical school, and my addiction in my 20s just messed that up. I didn't get the right courses, and it was just way too late to start. So that's one of those kind of alternate life paths that doesn't exist for me. But and I think there's a lot of those moments for people: lost relationships, lost opportunities.
Yeah, I think I was actually about 14 or 15 years sober when that one hit me really hard. It was like, I was about 50, and I was starting to think about, I'm going to have to retire, and one of these days. And, at the time I was, still a renter, and, had very few, and it was just like, oh my God, what did my addiction do to me? So I had to grieve that. And then I had to, get to the acceptance of, oh, I need to plan for the second half of my life here. I better get busy. And, it's still the process of grief. We have to grieve before we can even find gratitude in our life. So
Yeah.
I wanted to ask you one more. I wanted to make one more point. And then ask a question, and I promise we'll go to the Q&A. So type in questions into the Q&A. In the addiction, it's really a tidal wave of dopamine. And in sobriety, for both halves of a relationship, if there is a relationship, if not just for the addict, it's more of a slow drip, like an IV drip of dopamine. And, we have to get used to that, and we have to, sort of, again, we have to grieve that loss of intensity, but we can also become grateful for the slower dose, the lesser dose. We can learn to appreciate, the little roller coaster instead of the big giant roller coaster. And we can appreciate the things that come with the little roller coaster, which is a chance to develop intimacy, emotional closeness with friends and family and partners. There's so many gifts to that, but it's hard to see it when we're letting go of the intensity, because the intensity is so overriding.
Right. I remember my first year kind of rediscovering the taste of food as something I just had missed and didn't even know I missed it. But suddenly that's one of those little dopamine things, that, wow, I really enjoyed this meal. And or music, I'm classical trained musician, and that went out of my life for 20 years. But to rediscover the joy of a piece of music that I had really listened to in 20 years, that sort of stuff is really important, I think, for us to find that balance. We're not giving up dopamine. That's not what we want to do. We want to continue to maintain dopamine, but at levels that our brain can manage it and handle it, not these like super dumps of dopamine that are damaging to our brains itself. So yeah, learning how to do that, including learning the pleasures of, a slow buildup of sexual energy, or being held, of touch, without, focus on an orgasm or erection. Just those kind of intimate moments are incredibly powerful, and that subtlety kind of gets lost with these major dopamine events with the addiction.
Yeah, I can't reiterate that enough. It's much better to get the slow dopamine drip. Life is just much better. And the food thing, it's funny that some of my drinking buddies and I used to go to this restaurant in LA, and it was a Mexican place, and we would drink a couple pitchers of margaritas, and then we would order food, and we went there all the time. And after I got sober, I went there to eat one night, and it was terrible. He had been eating at this awful restaurant for years because we just never tasted the food. So anyway, neither here nor there. Let's get to the Q&A.
Okay.
Uh, I've been in a relationship with my sex addict for over 10 years, 3 years from discovery. My sex addict goes through stages of his addiction. He gets upset when I bring up the addiction and when I want to know his progress in recovery. When he knows I'm upset, he steps up and says he will work harder in his recovery. And it says in quote marks. It doesn't last long and he slips back into his denial. I get tired of walking on eggshells and need to work on my own betrayal trauma. Is it best that I don't ask about his recovery process, or should I give him an ultimatum? We have a 12-year-old daughter together.
Yeah, so this is hard when you have someone who's kind of in and out of that kind of denial stage and not quite fully stepping into recovery and back. You're stepping in and stepping out, and that pattern can go on for a lifetime. Yeah, so the anger is in this case not the anger we spoke of at the addiction, but really the anger at the people that are reminding him of his addiction, and that's a typical addict move. But you know, it's not helpful either, I think, to for him to keep kind of going back and forth and being in and out, obviously. So what is the role, the best course for a partner? And I think clearly you have a right to express your feelings and concern. I think that's always important. There are some issues, we spoke last week, I think, about boundaries where partners can sometimes get too involved and too controlling in an effort to seek safety and get things back on track, but it can turn into a counterproductive kind of thing. So I think it's important to say what you have to say and then let it go. And you know, I don't think it's healthy for you to be walking on eggshells, and that kind of creeping around an addict really doesn't do anybody good, and it's going to make you sick and cause you harm. So it's really important for you to have an ability to speak your mind fairly directly. And if you feel you can't say everything you need to say to him, then I would certainly hope you have a group or recovery support system where you can share these feelings. And also, by the way, share the situation and get some really good advice from other people who've been in a similar situation about what they would do, what's worked for them, what's not. And you don't feel as alone in this process as you probably do. I think ultimatums, it may come to an ultimatum. I would just start with real clear boundaries in the meantime. Set limits, and some of those may include an ultimatum. And remember, you want to make sure if you set an ultimatum that it's not just talk, it's something you will follow through on, because that's really important. And that's why I think that's kind of you want to maybe try other ways to have clear boundaries and discussions and that kind of thing, communication skills. This is where a third-party professional can often be really helpful to kind of guide the conversation, to help you work through what's an appropriate boundary for you, what's an appropriate expectation of him, and so on. So I'd get some help with that, both from peers. If you have a counselor who understands partner trauma, that would be really helpful for you as well. But I think, you know, you still, from what you said in this paragraph, you're still in this reactive mode where you're kind of reacting to his moves, whether he's in or he's out. If he's having a good day, maybe you have a good day. If he's having a bad day, it sounds like you may have a bad day. And that kind of connection to his dysfunction is not particularly helpful, I think.
Yeah, when I read that, the walking on eggshells, it gave me anxiety. I can only imagine what it's doing to you. And then the last sentence here says, we have a 12-year-old daughter together. And I'm thinking, oh my God, there's a child in the home with all of this. I'm projecting me into this, but you know, the anxiety that I have, and having walked on eggshells for most of my childhood. What is this kind of dynamic doing to a 12-year-old child in the home?
Yeah, so kids are like little emotional sponges. They absorb everything, and they also, unfortunately, pretty much take responsibility for whatever's going on in the home too. And so it's not a great situation for the child. It's sometimes helpful. Now, 12 years old, kids are starting to have some awareness, obviously, more than a younger child, of what's going on. And so I think it's important perhaps to talk to that 12-year-old, and the 12-year-old might also benefit from some kind of counseling or support where they can talk about their feelings, which most children have a lot of feelings about this, but they don't feel empowered to express them. And a lot of times there's fear, and it's an irrational fear, but it's very real to the child that if I express this, then there's a chance, I could be abandoned or left behind, or certainly not in a safe situation. This is uncomfortable and not helpful, but at least I know what this is, and I'm not in danger of having no shelter, no food, no family, which is where kids go sometimes with this stuff. But I think a 12-year-old, you can kind of sit down and have a pretty decent conversation to explain maybe what the situation is and ask them what they need. I think it's very helpful. Kids, by and large, are very resilient, but I think they really need some adult taking an interest in what they're experiencing and giving them a chance to talk about it and feel heard and connected. And I think that falls to you in this situation. But I would make sure that that child doesn't get lost in this whole dynamic.
Yeah, I think there's a publication by Al-Anon or Alateen, which is kind of the same organization, about how to talk to kids about addiction. I mean, they do it in the context of alcoholism, obviously, but basically it's, they need to know they didn't cause it. They need to know that they can't fix it. It's not theirs to fix. They need to know that they're still loved, and they need to know it's okay for them to get some support around it, to be able to talk about it and feel supported, and to get their questions answered. That's the big thing for kids that will help them not shoulder all the blame for something that's not their own.
And it's not unheard of to have kind of a disclosure process for kids. Kids are pretty aware and savvy of what's going on. And sometimes in an addiction home where there's denial, especially, kids can start to feel they're crazy, like they don't believe your lying eyes thing. They're seeing what they're seeing, they're feeling what they're feeling, but nobody's acknowledging that reality. And it's very confusing and painful for a child. So I think it's really, obviously you want to get some professional guidance on that, because kids aren't able to absorb all the data and details, nor should they be exposed to that. But I think they often know there's something sexually amiss in the home, and they have ideas about it, and rather than have their imaginations go wild, sometimes it's helpful to have some kind, gentle words for them.
Okay, let's go to the next one here. I agree it's important to reflect on the life not lived while thinking about life consequences on our way to accepting that we are indeed addicts who will continue to miss opportunities if we don't change. But I think it very important not to dwell in that space for too long, as it can take away from the beauty of the present moment and our ever evolving opportunities to change, grow, learn, accept, surrender, and forgive, and learn to love ourselves. Thoughts?
Yeah, I totally agree. It's important to recognize those things, as you point out. If we get hung up on those, that's where we can easily succumb to victimhood and regrets, and that set of beliefs and feelings was really the main fuel for my own addiction. It's just kind of feeling left out, missed opportunities, nothing ever goes right, poor me, and just it was a very bad place to be in. So like Scott, interesting, you said well into recovery, that concept dawned on you. And I think me too, in that I didn't even think about that. I was so busy trying to kind of survive in recovery, but it did occur to me, like the medical school thing. And I don't dwell on it, but it's been an important reminder that my addiction has had costs. And it's not something I want to dwell on, but yeah, for sure. It's important to recognize. And I always, addicts we very easily fall into this thing we call negativity bias, where we just kind of only see the bad stuff, and we kind of selectively don't even see the positive things that are around us in our lives. That's the great power of a gratitude list, by the way, to help us kind of train our brain to correct some of that negativity stuff. But this can be one of those situations, I think, where we can drop into that, all the missed stuff and all the mistakes we made, and yeah, it's not a space to build on. But I think it taken in the context of um, living my life to the full extent now in the circumstances I'm in now, it can be a helpful impetus to keep us moving forward. And I agree to really acknowledge the beautiful things. And that's another, to go back to that dopamine, the slow dopamine drip we were talking about. Um, life every day is full of wonderful little moments and joys that I think I totally was clueless about when I was in my addiction and kind of well into my recovery. But to really understand, the nice calls, the funny moment with my dog, the surprise of something. It doesn't even matter what it is, just to acknowledge the little joys, the little things. And they really do start to mean a whole lot.
Yeah, I'm so glad you typed this in. Grief is not a destination. We don't build a house and move in there. Grief is, I always picture grief as a tunnel that we travel through and we can see the light at the end of the tunnel. No matter how much we're grieving, we should still be able to see the light at the end of the tunnel. And then when we come out of it, it's this beautiful sunshiny day, and we can find gratitude. I spent about a year processing my life not lived grief. And the conclusion that I came to was, I really like my life today. I like who I am. I like what I do.
Love it.
I help people. I would not be this person if I had not screwed my life up so badly. And I like the person that I am. I'm not sure I would trade my life for that fantasy of the life not lived. I think I would keep the one I have. There's a lot of gratitude there, and that great point to just not get stuck in grief. And some people get stuck in grief, David, do they not?
Oh, totally. And I think, especially if there's a history of grief or incidents of grief, there's something that can be developed called complex grief, where it really kind of builds on itself and becomes kind of a way of life. And you can definitely get stuck in it. And then once they want to get out of it, a lot of people are afraid, my God, if I ever really start to feel all this grief I have inside me, it'll never stop. It's going to overwhelm me and I'm going to be crushed by it. And that's just not the case. Once the grief starts to flow, and I had a period of a couple of years where I actively was processing grief that I had built up from a lifetime. And one day it stopped. It was over. And that it was the end of that tunnel, like you described, Scott. It was an amazing kind of thing. My whole attitude changed, but I needed to get that out. It was a lifetime of stuff that wasn't released. And so, yeah, I think that's really, really important.
Yeah, and there may be other tunnels, but once I've gone through that tunnel for a certain grief, I don't tend to revisit it. I can think about it, but I just, right. I've done it. Been there, done that, right. Moved on.
And you said something, Scott, I just want to touch on too, that I have this terminology I use in my own recovery of lost and found, right? And in early recovery, for probably several years in early recovery, all I could see was the losses. And my addiction took a whole lot from me. But I also in recovery have found so much. And I think much like you, this is not the job I started out in. This is a totally different thing. I found a voice and a calling and a skill and a healing ability and all this stuff that I would not be doing if it weren't not for my addiction. So I think there's that too. We have to remember that this is addiction itself is not the end point. In recovery, recovery is a journey leading us to much better things.
Yeah, and just to build on that, I mean, I was unhappy long before I was an active addict. The addiction was me self-medicating my depression and anxiety and shame. And becoming an addict got me into recovery so that I could deal with those things. And I'm so grateful that I'm not overwhelmed by depression and anxiety and shame anymore. I still have those things, trust me, but they're not overwhelming. And without the gift of being an addict and all the misery that caused, I would probably still be an unhappy person, basically. I think that's fairly common. So, okay, thank you all so much for your advice and expertise. I am a partner of a sex addict who is 8 months in recovery. second round of counseling and work. We are in our 50s, second marriage of 6 years. And I totally relate to feeling sad about all the things I've missed in terms of having a true, loving, and connected relationship. I look at old pictures and feel empty about our past. I feel like it is being heightened now by the holidays. Any advice for a partner to deal with the grief of having lived in a marriage that was so full of lies and deceit? There's a lot packed into that one.
Yeah. So I just want to touch briefly on the whole holiday thing, because this is a time of year that for a lot of people can be very painful, simply because of what you said. But in looking at those old pictures, we're kind of bombarded with all this cheery holiday stuff on TV, and every one of us kind of thinks, well, that's how every other family is. This ideal, family we see on TV. Mine isn't like that, and so what's wrong with me? And so I think we kind of compare ourselves to these, hallmark images of the ideal, and it can cause a lot of pain if we're kind of caught in that comparison. Now, I think there's probably nothing more painful than realizing that a relationship you've been in for years, and the person with whom you've been in love for years isn't the person you thought they were. And I think that's a very painful realization to have. And I think there's this denial process we've been talking about tonight. Is the grieving process is really useful for that, because we can kind of move through. You said, any advice for a partner to deal with the grief of having lived in a marriage that was so full of lies and deceit? I think that those are a set of feelings that you need to move through. And I think it's just not, you don't want to get stuck in that grief. Like Scott just said, it's not the final destination, but it's really a process. And I think to look through that, and I would bet, especially if there's 8 months into recovery, okay, good. Counseling, I mean, there's some good work going on there. And I think usually what happens, if you can start that process moving through the grief process, you may find that the emptiness and the sadness that you're kind of locked in right now is going to shift a little bit. I think it's going to maybe open up. It's not minimizing those feelings that you have, but I think you start to get more feelings, and maybe see some of the good times, maybe recognize some good times that may be happening right now in recovery, or some new connections or new ways of being. So I think it's just, I would say, don't be afraid to feel the feelings. And that's the thing. You don't want to get stuck avoiding the feelings. You don't want to get stuck in any one particular feeling, including resentment and anger. That's a lot of, I think, partners get stuck in that. And that also is going to make you sick if you stay there. So I think just getting a lot of support. We have found that the best remedy for a lot of these things is, in fact, an essential component, I think, is having a really robust supportive network of people around you that get this, that get you, that you can talk to, and that you feel connected to. And I think that not going through this alone is really a critical piece of this. And I think it also, once we can get through some of the feelings, feel the grief, release it, I guess we get some perspective on this sometimes. And we also feel more empowered. When we're feeling just the grief and the regret, it's kind of a powerless place, and not in a good way. It's powerless that we don't have any kind of control, we've lost. And I think if we can start to feel feelings, we start to get agency for ourselves. We start to feel more in control. We start to have choices. And even if and I've told my clients, even if the choice is to start feeling the feelings, that's empowering you as well, as opposed to just being a victim of circumstance that has no choice about what they're feeling. We always have a choice about a direction to process things. I think even by taking on ownership of, I'm going to try to move through these feelings and change perspective. If it's only clarity to that it's not working, or what else you could do, but I think keeping it moving in terms of feelings is going to be really important.
Yeah, and I want to give you some hope for the future and for future holidays. And that requires me to talk a little bit about myself and my addiction, I think. And some of you have heard this story before. I apologize if you have, but for me, in retrospect, the bottom for me was not, arrests and job loss and all that kind of stuff, although those things happen. The bottom for me is Christmas Eve 2000. My sister had just had a new baby. I lived in LA. She lived in Orange County. My parents lived in Indiana. They flew out to see her and the new baby, and I drove down and we did Christmas Eve at my sister's house. She made a nice dinner. We went to midnight mass, which was, like 10 p.m. or something. And after that, instead of going back to her house and sleeping in one of the many spare bedrooms, I said I wanted to sleep in my own bedroom. So I drove back to LA and did not sleep in my own bedroom. I got high and cruised the streets looking for prostitutes until about 6 a.m. And then I went home and showered and put on some clean clothes and went back to my sister's to have breakfast and open presents with my family. And there are pictures of me, and I am literally just not there. I'm not present. There are pictures and not even the next day on Christmas Day when I was so tired, but from Christmas Eve dinner when I'd just gotten there. And I can see my eyes in those pictures, and I know that I wanted to leave. I wasn't focused on dinner. I wasn't focused on my family. I wasn't focused on the holiday, the new baby, anything. I wanted to leave so that I could act out, so that I could get high and act out. And as soon as I could do that, that's what I did. And that is what I never, ever, ever want to experience again. I would go sit in jail for months before I would experience that again. And now in recovery, when I spend time with my family, I am genuinely there with them, to the point where they notice, and they're grateful that I'm there, and filled with love and present, and it has been one of the greatest gifts of my recovery, is to be able to show up for the people that I love and the people who love me. And that can happen. And your partner's in recovery. It looks like he's doing the counseling and the work. It's going to be a roller coaster. This holiday may not be your best holiday, but there are better holidays to come. There really are. So I'm sorry, I'm getting emotional.
Thank you, Scott. Yeah, wonderful.
So, okay, what is the difference between my recovering addict partner having 1.5 pack a day cigarettes 2 years ago for 40 years versus now where he relapses and smokes about 1 to 2 cigarettes a week as far as healing the brain goes? Love this question. Cigarettes in the brain.
Cigarettes in the brain. Yeah, so, I mean, obviously 1 or 2 a week is better than 1.5 packs a day for year after year. At Seeking Integrity, we have this philosophy about nicotine and the powerful drug it is. Nicotine gives us more dopamine than an orgasm. It's a very powerful drug. It's a very powerful release. And any former smoker like me can tell you how hard it is to give it up. It's a mean addiction. A lot of treatment centers who are treating drug addiction often will allow their clients to smoke. And we just believe that's just wrong and almost unethical, frankly, because nicotine is such a powerful drug, and nicotine works in the brain almost exactly the same way as sex, porn, and chemsex. It just mimics those drugs, just a lesser level of dopamine, although not insignificant level of dopamine being released. And so when you're giving up everything else and continue to smoke, your brain is like in this idle mode. It never quite shuts off in that addictive way. And so it really makes, it teaches your brain how to be addicted. It primes your brain for addiction. It makes it, frankly, easier to relapse. So we just think it's best to just get a clean slate and get rid of cigarettes. Now, 1 to 2 cigarettes a week, I think is far better. I guess we'd have to call that harm reduction. Okay, ideally not. I guess my question would be, why Well, first of all, I don't know what other relapses there are. Maybe you're talking about relapses to cigarettes. That could be maybe more severe. But I guess if I were his therapist, I'd say, why 1-2 cigarettes? Why not just give them all up? What's that about? And what urges that? And so I think it's just useful to look at. But the bottom line for me, the takeaway here is that nicotine is a powerful drug. It's not a good drug for somebody in recovery, I believe, and it just makes it easier to kind of switch back to our more primary addiction when we're in trouble. So I know some people, myself included, part of my denial of facing and being an alcoholic was that I thought cigarettes were the real problem, and I gave up smoking. And of course, nothing got better because I kept drinking more and more. When I finally got sober, I gave up. I picked up cigarettes again, thinking, well, screw that. I need something. And that's kind of what I'm hearing here. It's like, well, it's maybe not as bad as whatever the primary addiction is, but it's a troublesome addiction. So I gave it up on my first anniversary, and I think ideally, if your husband could just give, or your partner could give those up, totally be better. But 1 to 2 cigarettes is far better than more, but none is better.
And what worries me about this, this is the same thing as sex addicts who, or especially porn addicts, who had masturbation as a big part of their addictive cycle. Usually the payoff for them was masturbating. And they think, well, I'm not going to masturbate to porn, but I'll still masturbate, but I'll only do it twice a week. And the conversation, is that okay? They always say, is that okay? Can I masturbate once or twice a week with no porn? And, I always come back to, what is the motivation? Are you using masturbation to escape? Are you using it as a coping mechanism? And I would ask the same question about those 1 or 2 cigarettes a week. What's the impetus for digging out that cigarette once or twice a week? What are you getting from it? Is it a coping mechanism? If it is, that's a pretty addictive thing to do. And maybe instead of smoking a cigarette, you should talk to your partner, or you should reach out to your one of your fellows in recovery, or there are better coping mechanisms. And I also wonder if he admits to smoking 1 or 2 cigarettes a week, how many is he smoking? I worry about that, but I'm going to take this as fact that he smokes 1 to 2 cigarettes a week.
But I think that the really important point is that we need in recovery to seek out other ways of getting that dopamine. Remember, we're not giving up dopamine where we want to get dopamine, but at more human scale levels, but in other ways. So instead of those cigarettes, maybe take a walk, a mindfulness walk, or ride a bike, or listen to music, or play with your dog or cat, or cook a good meal, or do something. But I think there are better ways to get that little dopamine hit.
David, you've got a graph somewhere of like the dopamine hits. I'm not going to ask you to dig it up right now, but can you kind of walk people through the levels that we get from various,
Right. And so there are so-called natural rewards that, we get normal levels of the reason we have this reward circuitry in our brain and dopamine is that we get reinforced with feel-good dopamine when we do things that help us survive as a species. And so that things like cooperating and collaborating and sharing good food and bonding with each other and feeling like we belong, and even humor, and most of all, orgasm. Those are all, orgasm is basically twice the normal level of kind of walking around dopamine. Things like food, by the way, good food. If you have comfort food, bread, pasta, whatever it is for you, ice cream, those give you a little more of a bump of dopamine, which is why we have food addiction out there. People get sedated with the dopamine that's coming there. But then beyond an orgasm, which is like twice the rate of normal dopamine, we hit drugs. And that's where nicotine comes in at like 220 or 2.2 times an orgasm. And then cocaine, like at 3.5 times an orgasm. And then it just skyrockets up to methamphetamine is about 14 times more than a normal dose of meth and orgasm. I mean, of just plain walking around dopamine. So methamphetamine is this huge dump of dopamine that just overwhelms the brain's capacity to deal with it. So sometime I'll have that chart. It just is a very dramatic thing. You see
but nicotine is like way up on the scale
oh, yeah,
compared to things that you would think like alcohol would give you a bigger pump, and it doesn't. It's nicotine gives a much bigger pump than
right,
alcohol
right.
and most drugs.
And amphetamines, and of course, nicotine amphetamines are notorious for the dopamine release. And as I say, they work in the brain the same way sex and porn addiction does. That's why we treat them successfully altogether at Seeking Integrity.
Yeah. So, yeah, I'm a big believer in, I have multiple addictions. I'm an alcoholic and a drug addict and a sex addict. And I wish I had gotten sober from all of them at the same time. Then I would have had to only go through the withdrawal and the fight against an addiction once. I could have gotten them all out of the way at the same time. I would have been much happier. But it didn't work that way for me. I held on to my drinking for a couple of years after I gave up the sex and the drugs. But we're out of time. Thank you, everybody, for being here. Thank you for your great questions. David, thank you for a great topic about grieving the addiction. Anything you want to say to take us out?
Yeah, just remember that the grieving process is not linear. We kind of bounce around in circles sometimes, but the point is to keep moving and keep moving toward acceptance, which is the end point. But it takes some work and some understanding, but it's a really essential process to let go of the addiction and whatever appeal we think it still holds for us.
Thank you. We'll be back next week, same time, same place. Bring your questions with you, and we'll see you then.
Okay. Good night, everyone.